Did it! 8 minutes. Blimey. In this lecture, we'll be discussing a means of composing music using Xenakis' cubes and ghost cubes. Now, I have to be honest with you, it's difficult for me to decipher what Xenakis' process is exactly from the literature available. Therefore, I'm just going to tell you what I was taught as a music student about this method of composing, and I'm going to refer to existing literature to either confirm that Xenakis used this approach, or to expand upon it. Xenakis was born in Romania in 1922, and he died in Paris in 2001. Xenakis was a civil engineer with a background in architecture, and this is important. From 1947 onwards, Xenakis became assistant to the architect Le Corbusier in Paris. And this is also very crucial. Architecture would be a major influence in Xenakis' compositions, an example being the piece Metastasis, which was composed between 1953 and 1954. Now, the preliminary sketch for Metastasis looked more like blueprints than a score and ended up serving as the basis for the design of the Philips Pavilion. And if you want to read more about this, I did write about this in a chapter on Xenakis in a book about Xenakis. It was originally my undergraduate dissertation. The bits about Xenakis and architecture were anyway. Now this is interesting. Xenakis studied with Messiaen, amongst other noteworthy people. But I'll focus on Messiaen for now, because this is interesting. Apparently, anyone who was anyone in the mid-20th century studied with Messiaen. But Messiaen couldn't teach Xenakis, in a good way. Messiaen couldn't add to Xenakis' ideas. Now, according to Matosian, useful book to check out, Messiaen said about Xenakis, "I understood straight away that he was not someone like the others. He is of superior intelligence. I did something horrible which I should do with no other student, for I think one should study harmony and counterpoint. But this was a man so much out of the ordinary that I said, 'No, you are almost 30. You have the good fortune of being Greek, of being an architect and having studied special mathematics. Take advantage of these things. Do them in your music.'" And by the way, if you're interested in Messiaen, I have a video on his quartet pour la fin du temps. Quartet pour la fin du temps. How's that for a French accent? We're going to look at a composition called Nomos Alpha, composed in 1965, and this uses his cube technique, which is just great. So the piece we'll be looking at is a piece for solo cello. It's an interesting piece, and part of it is actually physically impossible to play on the cello. If you listen to it, you'll be able to hear the bit. It's like there are two cellos, suddenly one pitch goes very, 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 very high, and one goes very, very low, and it's like this chord goes, it's like physically, how are you going to do that on a cello? Most performers use a backing track during a live performance of this piece, or they just multi-track record it if they're making a recording. Some cellists do a leapy double stop where they leap from the high pitch to the low pitch and sort of be a bit creative with it that way. Composition students can't get away with writing this because you'll lose marks. It's physically impossible to actually play what he's notated. Unless you cleverly write a commentary that says, well, I wanted to provide something completely impossible to play to see how the performer would struggle with it, to render sounds that I would not have done otherwise. But don't do that, because in terms of an exam, it's kind of like creating an excuse for bad writing. Especially this method we're going to look at. It throws up things that need to be modified, as you will see. So it's kind of ironic that he ended up writing something completely physically impossible to perform, which the cube possibly generated. There are two contrasting approaches to generating compositional material in this piece, and these are called V1 and V2. I don't know what the V stands for. Now V1 is the path around the cube, which I'll explain in more detail shortly. V2 is a more free and intuitive way of thinking about music. So it's where you just get to compose as you feel freely. You don't have to follow a process, it's just let the expression come out. But it is kind of based on what you've just written with the cube, so... 1 minute. Now the whole piece is in 24 sections, 6 groups of 4. So to clarify, Nomos Alpha is structured as follows. You have V1, 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 V2, and now this happens 6 times, where V1 uses the material generated by the cube technique, and V2 is a more free, intuitive way of composing. Now, let's have a look at the V1 sections. All the V1 sections are composed using an imaginary set of 3D cubes. So you have a cube, this is a cube, and then you'd have a cube around it, a ghost cube. Basically there's a cube, within a cube, within a cube, within a cube, and there are musical parameters around all the points of these cubes. Now, in order to generate compositional material for your music, one simply rotates the cubes in various ways to generate different combinations of parameters. And once a line of parameters is aligned throughout the cubes and ghost cubes and all these corners, you then notate that down in your score. I suppose the cubes are kind of like Russian nesting dolls, and they just align with each other. So what parameters do we need for these cubes then? Well, pitch, duration, dynamics, articulation. Those are 4 things that match neatly onto 4 cubes. I did notice when I wrote this piece for my undergraduate degree that there was a lot of patterns in 4s and 16s and things, everything that sort of fits mathematically. Let's now look at how Xenakis assigned pitches to his cube and likewise his composition, Nomos Alpha. He incorporated quarter tones and tones and semitones in his piece. And so if we're going to compose in this manner and better understand Nomos Alpha and Xenakis' compositional approach, we need to pick 8 pitches that include quarter tones in our selection. So, step 1. Start with a quarter tone scale of 24 pitches, instead of 12 pitches that you'd get in a chromatic scale. Quite easy. Think of your chromatic scale and include those quarter tones in there, 24 pitches. Now, this is a non-octavating scale. I'll explain more about this non-octavating scale in a bit, but first, let's generate some pitches. So, step 2. Next, you just sieve some pitches from this scale of 24 pitches. This basically just means pick some notes intuitively, as you want. You can, if you want, pick one, miss one, pick one, miss one, just do what you want. Generate a little pattern if you want. Just sieve them through, sieve out 8 pitches. So why 8 pitches? Well, you want 8 pitches to fill the 8 corners of your pitch cube. Now once you've picked your 8 pitches, stick to them. They are fixed frequencies. They can't be moved up or down the octave. As I mentioned, they are non-octavating. They're not pitch classes, they are those frequencies. This might seem restrictive to one's compositional approach, but that's the point. These restrictions help you compose something you wouldn't have done otherwise had you just composed what you already know. Also, battling with restrictions can force you to think of creative solutions, because think about it, if you have different instruments, one may be an oboe, one may be a double bass, there's going to be some pitches that they can't both play, so you have to think of modifications, which is the point, and we'll get onto that in a moment. Right, assigning other compositional parameters to the outer cubes. So then you pick your durations intuitively and assign them to the 4 corners of the cube outside, surrounding, depending on how you're viewing this, your pitch cube. So you get your pitch cube and you've got a cube around that. Assign some durations to that. This is a ghost cube around the first cube. I don't know if Xenakis himself called these ghost cubes. I've had a brief look at the literature, but not in depth, and I haven't come across this exact terminology yet. I know my composition lecturer called them ghost cubes, and this is a useful way to refer to them, as essentially that's what they are. I remember when I was an undergraduate reading about, I think, in formalised music, something about axiomatic clouds, but don't quote me on that. Formalised music is intensely mathematical. Anyway. The assembling of the ghost cubes gets easier once the first and second ones are done. You do the same for the third ghost cube. And in this one you'd have 8 dynamics, around 8 points of a third ghost cube. Then again with the fourth cube for 8 articulation directions, so you'd have like staccato, legato, accent and so on the fourth ghost cube. Now you've got 4 cubes floating about each other, kind of like Russian nesting dolls, as I've said. Got a cube within a cube within a cube within a cube. And each can rotate in various ways. Different musical parameters on various corners can coincide with other musical parameters on other corners of different cubes. So just think about it as turning it around. You have an articulation here that coincides with a pitch, that coincides with a dynamic, and then maybe you rotate the outer cube and that coincides with a different articulation and a different pitch, and you might rotate an inner cube, and you just generate different musical material that way. So now you've got a means of generating material. You rotate the cubes in various ways. Maybe you rotate the initial cube clockwise, one way, and the outer one anti-clockwise, for instance. It's up to you, basically. You choose your own pathway through all the cubes. That's correct. That's not correct. That's correct. That's not correct. Now, you will have to make modifications to the material that is generated. This is because, for instance, what if, say, the cube generated a Bartok pizzicato on a pianissimo dynamic? This is impossible, isn't it? Because by nature, Bartok pizzicatos are loud. You can't play them without force. The whole point is to pull on that string and have it snap back against the neck of the string instrument. Therefore, you'd have to modify either the dynamic or the articulation in this instance. So you'd have to modify the dynamic to be either fortissimo or the articulation to be just a quiet pizzicato, standard pizz. Likewise, maybe the cube triggers some inspiration and you like what the cube generates, but maybe you want to alter the rhythm. This is fine too. You are a composer after all. You might just want to modify the rhythm. That's correct. That's correct. That's correct. That's correct. Okay. These cubes are just a means of generating ideas and expanding your own compositional voice, basically. Useful for writer's block, but don't fetishize the pre-compositional process, because that becomes an issue in itself. We are still composers. We still have to write music. Composition is still about composing. In the V2 sections of Nomos Alpha, Xenakis uses pitches from a different non-octavating scale. Apparently, according to my lecture notes, this different non-octavating scale is a 3/4 tone scale. Again, I can't really find anything on this in the literature yet. So if you find more information about this, by all means let me know. But still, this was useful for me to compose with. A 3/4 tone scale offers a variation in the harmonic sound world of the composition for the V2 sections. It's different from the quarter tone harmonic sound world that was in the V1 section. Right, nearly done. The crucial thing to note about the V2 sections, and this is indeed true of Xenakis' Nomos Alpha, is that this second non-octavating scale is not as rigorously processed as in his V1 sections. Simply put, the process is just not strictly followed. He uses glissandi even when this sort of incorporates all the pitches. By nature, glissandis do. So he kind of breaks his rules more freely here. There are some obvious themes though. In the V2 sections, Xenakis uses extremes of registers, string harmonics for instance, and notes that are longer and more sustained. V2 gives a break to the overall musical texture and feel of the V1 sections. And remember, a V2 section happens every fourth section. As I said at the beginning, Nomos Alpha is structured as follows: V1, 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 V2, and this happens 6 times, where V1 uses the material generated by the cube technique that I've just mentioned, and V2 is a freer more intuitive way of composing. There are a number of things to consider about instruments when composing in general, but especially when using this cube method, because it can generate things that are not going to work in terms of overall balance and logistics. First, in terms of overall balance, it's not useful if the cube gives you a pianissimo dynamic in the oboe part and an FFF fortissimo in the trombone part, for instance, because you just won't hear the oboes that way. And this is impractical to write. It's not considerate composing. The oboe part just won't be heard, and so there's no point in notating it, is there? Therefore, you must modify the material accordingly. You'll have to alter the dynamics so that all the parts can be heard, if you want that. Second, in terms of instrumental practicalities and logistics, remember that wind instrument performers need to breathe when they're not playing as well. So make sure the cube hasn't generated a lot of impractical wind writing that doesn't let the performers take a breath. Make sure string chords are playable. Make sure those double stops, quadruple stops, whatever, are actually practical. No doubt you'll come up with other impracticalities as you play around with the cubes. It's just going to happen. There are also some common errors when it comes to rhythmic notation. So the cube is throwing out a bunch of rhythms that don't necessarily fit neatly with your bar lines or your time signatures in the score. Therefore, you'll have to alter the rhythmic grouping as appropriate. This is just basic music theory. As an uber basic example, in 6/8, you wouldn't write 3 crotchets like it was 3/4. You'd tie notes appropriately so that the main pulse in the time signature comes through. Basically, think like a conductor when you write your score. As composers, you should know this. It's just be aware of this. You can easily forget this when you're writing it down in the score because you're too immersed in the cube. Also, in terms of performance directions, be specific. Even how high up you want a trombonist to sit, for instance. Just be very specific. What mallets does the percussionist need? Where should everyone sit on the stage? Where is the audience in relation to this? And so on. Composers today are very specific, and you should be too. Make it your own. Don't just copy what Xenakis did. Modify it to suit you. Be creative. Use your own approach. For instance, when I was an undergraduate, this is what I did. I wrote a piece for 8 instrumentalists: oboe 1 and 2, trombone 1 and 2, percussion 1 and 2, violin 1 and 2. This lineup, including the individual percussion instruments, 8 in total, were assigned to us by the lecturer. Now, there were too many patterns of 8s for me not to go totally intense with cubes rotating around cubes, around cubes, around cubes. I can't talk about every single detail about this composition because it was insanely intense, and this requires a whole other video in itself. But I will say, though, that I placed each instrument on a corner of the large cube so that each was not directly next to a similar instrument. This was to prevent similar material being repeated by the same timbres. For instance, if the oboe 1 cube was passed on to oboes 2, for example. I mean, why did I do that? Why did I give, like, the percussionist 2 cube to the oboe? Well, because if I did that, I would have to think of really new ways of modifying. How do you play an oboe like a triangle, for instance? Well, key clicks, maybe. So I really had to work around the problems that I'd given myself to generate stuff that I wouldn't have written otherwise. Therefore, each V1 consisted of 8 cubes being played by a different instrument and rotated in a different way. I just have to say, when I wrote this piece, this really hurt my head. Now, in keeping with the Xenakis approach, each V2 section is more static, employing extremes of instrumental registers. It adds a contrast to each V1 section. There is so much to talk about where this composition is concerned. I even had cubes to determine time signatures across the piece. And while we're at it though, let's look at one of the pitched instruments cubes to see what different parameters we can have in the cube and overlapping ghost cubes. So here's my oboe 1 cube and ghost cubes that sit on top or envelop each subsequent cube like Russian nesting dolls. These can be rotated, kinda like a Rubik's Cube can be rotated, so that each corner coincides with a different corner and therefore a different collection of parameters collides with each other. And this can be notated down and modified as appropriate. Now, in my piece, all these instrumental cubes and their subsequent ghost cubes rotated around themselves continuously throughout each V1 section. So I didn't just have a cube around cubes like a Russian nesting dolls. I had like 8 of these rotating around another cube, like the grand cube. Oh, it was nuts. I remember when I went to hand my work in, I was so tired that I was like trying to order a train ticket and I was just like 5 crab chicks in 3 bars. I was like, oh sorry, can I have a ticket to Leeds please? Incongruities in the cube technique arose throughout my composition. Occasionally, articulation and note duration contradicted each other. Other note durations had to be altered in order to execute certain articulations. Also, crescendo or diminuendo markings were added to make the transition from one dynamic to another when these occurred on a single note, for instance. Try to think about the instrumentalist in every case. The dynamics of the oboe had to be altered as it is difficult to execute piano dynamics in the lower fifth of its range. Now, I'm not saying that, a professional oboist won't be able to do this, they probably will, but, why make it difficult for performers? Similarly, when oboe 2 plays a trombone 2 cube, the designated pitches exceed the oboe's range. Therefore, this was replaced with oboe key clicks. So I modified it to oboe key clicks. But you could, I suppose, modify the pitches, although that would go against the whole point of having a non-octavating scale, wouldn't it? You've got to work with your restrictions. I wouldn't have written key clicks otherwise, would I? There are so many other modifications made to this piece that I detailed in my composition commentary. I won't go into them because you probably don't need to hear it. Composing this piece, for me, at the time, as an undergraduate, was the most mind-opening experience. It's just because there's so many parameters rotating around parameters, and when you think in that perspective, you see all this stuff coinciding, and it's like this complex macrocosm of interacting tiny things that you just think. Anyway, you don't need to hear me rambling on, even if you have made it this far in the video.